1 million chickens, not on a farm, not in coops, but released into the wild. Across fields, forests, and villages of Burkina Faso, the ground shook not from tanks, but from the flapping wings of birds let loose by presidential decree. When Captain Ibrahim Traore stood before his nation and declared he would unleash a feathered army to fight a plague of insects, the world scoffed. Advisors hesitated. Western journalists sneered. A poultry stunt, they called it. A waste in a land that can't afford whimsy. But the crisis was real. Fields were dying, crops devoured by swarms of locusts and waves of caterpillars. Pesticides, imported at great cost, poisoned the fragile soil. Aid was slow, conditional, and came with strings that knotted sovereignty. So Traore turned to chickens, nature's underestimated infantry. Each one hungry for beetles, worms, locusts, whatever crawled, they devoured. Was it madness? Or was it something Africa had waited for all along? Stay with us. This isn't satire, it's strategy. Burkina Faso dared the world to laugh. But what if they were right? Subscribe and witness a story where sovereignty wears feathers. It began with silence, and then the storm. Burkina Faso, a landlocked nation in the heart of the Sahel, found itself under siege, not by tanks or rebels, but by wings. Swarms of desert locusts, ravenous and ancient, blackened the skies. Beneath them, fields of sorghum, millet, and maize disappeared overnight. Entire harvests, months of labor, reduced to dust within hours. The air carried a strange hum, the sound of insects feasting. Families watched in despair as the food they had grown for their children was devoured. Crops wilted under the double assault of drought and predation. Farmers who once relied on the rhythm of the seasons now feared the return of every cloud. And international aid? It came late, as it often does. When it arrived, it was bound in bureaucracy, tied to foreign chemical solutions, pesticides shipped in from Europe at extortionate prices. These compounds promised control, but left the earth poisoned and farmers indebted. The soil of the Sahel, already fragile, weakened further. Ibrahim Traore, then still a young president and former army captain, stood at a crossroads. He could follow the familiar path: loans, chemicals, dependency. Or he could gamble. He chose the gamble. In a move that stunned even his own cabinet, Traore announced that Burkina Faso would release 1 million chickens into the wild. Not into farms, not into cages, into the ecosystem, to roam, scratch, and feed. The idea seemed absurd to many. Journalists rolled their eyes. Social media exploded in mockery. Western commentators dubbed it a rural circus. But Traore stood firm. At a tense parliamentary session, facing skeptics and critics, he said just 6 words: "This is not chaos. This is strategy." His logic was, in fact, biologically sound. Chickens are voracious omnivores. A single bird can eat hundreds of insects in a day: locusts, beetles, caterpillars, larvae. They peck, scratch, and search endlessly. Multiply that instinct by 1 million, and you have a natural, decentralized pest control army. But the president's plan went beyond insect control. Each chicken, he argued, was not only a soldier, but a provider. When pests waned, the chickens would remain, laying eggs, reproducing, feeding communities. It was a cyclical strategy: destroy the destroyers, then nourish the people. The logistics, however, were daunting. To procure, breed, and distribute 1 million birds required national mobilization. Poultry farms scaled up overnight. Hatching centers operated round the clock. Thousands of volunteers and officials were trained in animal care, distribution protocols, and ecological management. The country was divided into zones. Chickens were delivered to strategic points, some dropped by trucks, others by motorcycles navigating rough terrain. Rural councils coordinated efforts to ensure the birds weren't clustered, but spread evenly across the land. The goal was maximum coverage, minimal overlap. Then came the day of release. It was a spectacle unlike any in African political memory. Across provinces, from dry plains to tree-lined hamlets, villagers gathered as trucks rolled in, crates stacked high with feathers and beaks. The air was thick with anticipation. Children clapped as gates swung open and chickens burst into new freedom. Farmers watched, half skeptical, half hopeful. News cameras rolled. Drone footage swept across scenes of chickens scattering through the bush, pecking, exploring, claiming territory. One foreign correspondent whispered into her microphone, "This may be the strangest defense strategy I've ever seen." But for Traore, the visuals were deliberate. He knew what optics could do. A flock of chickens charging into farmland told a more compelling story than any dry report. It ignited imagination. It sparked debate. It made people talk. And most importantly, it sent a message. Burkina Faso would not rely on the old methods. It would not beg for pesticides. It would not accept the premise that innovation must come from abroad. This was African creativity, African resilience, and African sovereignty in motion. The gamble had been made. The chickens were free. The cameras had captured the moment. But would it work? The flocks had scattered. The insects still swarmed. But in the days to come, the soil would reveal who truly ruled the land, locust or chicken. In the first few days, it seemed little had changed. The insects were still there, buzzing, crawling, devouring. But then something shifted, slowly, quietly. In the eastern provinces, farmers began to notice strange gaps in the locust swarms. Places where the skies were no longer blackened, fields where young shoots survived longer than usual. By the second week, reports started trickling in. Chickens were doing something. Villagers described them like sentinels, roaming the edges of fields, pecking relentlessly at anything that moved. No longer confined to coops, they had adapted quickly to life in the wild. They formed loose clusters, migrating between farm plots, sleeping in brush and thickets, feeding at dawn and dusk. Some even began nesting under overturned carts and old trees. Then came the real proof. In Kuritenga province, satellite mapping of farmland showed a 40% decrease in visible pest damage compared to regions without chickens. In Namantenga, a veteran farmer who once lost half his crop to worms and beetles reported a harvest richer than any in 10 years. When asked what changed, he pointed and said simply, "The birds fight for us." Eggs began appearing in the markets, plentiful and affordable. Protein intake among children rose in areas where the birds had roamed. Mothers who had never before sold poultry now sat roadside with baskets of eggs and young chicks. In the markets of Kaya and Bobo Dioulasso, prices for imported protein fell as domestic supplies surged. The people noticed. More importantly, the people began to believe. Where once they had scoffed at Traore's strange gamble, now they watched with renewed interest. Was this really working? Could it be that this strange, chaotic experiment had found its rhythm? On local radio stations, callers debated, will chickens save Burkina Faso? Some called it madness turned miracle. Others called it faith made flesh. And then the emotional climax, the moment the mockery turned to momentum. Western journalists who had once penned headlines like Burkina Faso goes to the birds or Africa's feathery folly began to adjust their tone. Articles now carried terms like biocontrol model, natural pest suppression, and agroecological success. The same cameras that had filmed with smirks now returned to document what they called a grassroots revolution in pest management. But it was not just the results that caught the world's eye. It was Ibrahim Traore's refusal to flinch under pressure. In an interview with France 24, he smiled and said, "Yes, chickens are foolish, but sometimes the foolish win." That sentence echoed across screens and streets. By disarming criticism with wit, Traore had done something few politicians manage. He turned ridicule into curiosity, then into respect. Delegations from Niger, Mali, and even Kenya quietly sent agricultural observers, not to mock, but to learn. In the town of Tenkodago, a group of elders held a meeting beneath a tree. The topic, whether to build permanent chicken shelters to support the wild flocks. One of them stood up and declared, "No one has ever fought locusts with chickens, but if it is our chickens, it is our solution." The others nodded in agreement. The words became a refrain, repeated across regions. The language was changing. No longer did people say, "the government's chickens." They said, "our chickens." Ownership, identity, pride. And this was exactly what Traore had intended. He was not merely fighting pests, he was reprogramming how the people saw themselves. No longer as victims waiting for international aid, but as innovators crafting local solutions with local resources. The chickens had become avatars of this mindset. They peck through fields, yes, but they also scratch through the chains of dependency. International think tanks now scrambled to study the Burkina Faso model. European students applied for fieldwork grants to visit what had once been dismissed as a joke. Agricultural journals published articles comparing the chickens' impact to chemical pesticides, and the birds were winning. At home, the opposition was left scrambling. How do you attack a program that feeds children and protects crops? They called it expensive. Traore replied, hunger costs more. They called it unserious. He responded with data, videos, testimonies. Every critique seemed to strengthen the program's position. And so in less than a season, what had started as a gamble became a movement. What had been a spectacle became strategy. And what the world once laughed at was now being studied, replicated, and praised. But would this momentum last, or had Burkina Faso merely found a miracle with feathers? The chickens were not just eating insects, they were eating away at an old idea, that solutions must come from the outside. In the months following the release, the social and political ripple effects became impossible to ignore. The birds had changed more than the balance between pests and crops. They had begun to rewire an entire national psyche. In the villages, chickens became wealth, not symbolic wealth, tangible, feathered currency. Families that received even a handful of birds began breeding them, trading chicks for grain or tools. Where there had once been dependence on foreign aid, there was now an ecosystem of informal commerce pulsing with energy. The rural economy was stirring. Women, in particular, became central to this transformation. Following Traore's directive, 30% of the chickens were distributed to female-headed households. In a country where women had long been sidelined from land ownership and formal agricultural programs, this was a radical shift. With control over birds that reproduced, laid eggs, and fed families, women found themselves holding new social leverage. In town after town, roadside stalls filled with egg vendors, most of them women, sprang up. These weren't charity beneficiaries. They were micro-entrepreneurs. And with income came voice. In community meetings, women began to speak with greater confidence, not as dependents but as producers. This was not just economic change. It was political. Suddenly, a large swathe of the rural population, often forgotten or manipulated by central governments, felt seen, felt heard. They weren't just watching policy unfold from afar. They were living it, benefiting from it, owning it. Ibrahim Traore understood that empowerment was more than programs. It was perception. And perception, once shifted, was difficult to reverse. The opposition found themselves cornered. In urban centers, they attempted to mock the government's focus on chickens. They warned of long-term costs, hinted at ecological imbalance. But every talking point was drowned out by the testimonies of rural farmers. I haven't bought pesticide in 6 months. My children eat eggs now, not just porridge. Our fields are green again. Each testimony was a dagger in the heart of political cynicism. The ruling party quickly realized the potency of this new narrative and expanded the program's messaging. Billboards in Ouagadougou and Farangourma showed mothers carrying baskets of eggs with the tagline, "This is not aid, this is sovereignty." Burkina Faso, long caricatured as dependent, fragile, peripheral, was now telling a new story. And its people were not just listening, they were repeating it. The Ministry of Agriculture launched training sessions for youth in poultry care, egg incubation, and co-op management. These weren't just skills, they were symbols. For the first time, being a chicken farmer carried a sense of national pride. At the National University, a new certificate in agroecological pest control was launched. Students enrolled in droves. Professors who had once taught pesticide application now lectured on biocycles, soil regeneration, and the political economy of self-reliance. The chickens had even reached the curriculum. Internationally, Burkina Faso began receiving quiet admiration. At a conference in Dakar, a delegate from Ghana remarked, "I didn't think chickens could change a country, but I was wrong." The room laughed, but the undertone was serious. People were watching, people were learning. And what was most stunning, this shift in national direction didn't come from a loan agreement or an international donor roadmap. It came from one audacious decision, one unapologetic bet, and one man's refusal to wait for permission. It came from Ibrahim Traore. As months passed, agricultural exports began to rise. With more grain preserved from insect damage, surplus stocks found their way into trade routes toward Mali, Niger, even northern Ghana. What was once wasted was now monetized. The national budget showed savings, not just from reduced pesticide imports, but from lowered costs in malnutrition treatment, school feeding subsidies, and emergency food aid. Economic modeling suggested that in the first year alone, the chicken strategy had saved over $70 million. But even more potent than numbers was the psychological shift. Burkinabe citizens, especially those in rural belts, no longer saw themselves as recipients. They saw themselves as innovators. For too long, the language of development had been one of deficit. We lack. We need. We wait. Now the tone had changed. We build. We solve. We lead. Do you believe this is what African innovation looks like? Type Africa Rising if you do. The chickens had indeed pecked through something deeper than pest control. They had cracked the hard shell of colonial dependency and political apathy. And from it, something proud and powerful began to hatch. But how would the world respond to a poor country rewriting the rules, one chicken at a time? As Burkina Faso's fields turned greener and its markets fuller, the world took notice. But not all with applause. At first, Western institutions viewed Traore's chicken program as a curiosity, an amusing anecdote in the margin of global development discourse. Editorials in Paris and Brussels called it rural pageantry, while think tanks in London warned of ecological imbalance caused by unmanaged poultry populations. But behind the patronizing tones lay a deeper unease. This wasn't just about chickens. It was about the audacity of a small, resource-limited African country solving a massive problem with zero input from foreign consultants, chemicals, or capital. And worse, for those who profited from dependency, it was working. European policymakers, nervous about the precedent, commissioned studies questioning the long-term viability of releasing chickens into the wild. They warned of zoonotic risks, food safety gaps, and unsustainable population growth. The press repeated these fears, hoping to cast doubt on the Burkina model. But Ibrahim Traore did not respond with anger. He responded with evidence. His administration invited scientists from African universities, not Paris or Geneva, to conduct peer-reviewed field studies. Their results, presented at regional summits, confirmed it. Pest damage had decreased dramatically, food production was up, and no significant ecological harm was recorded. And suddenly the mockers were silenced. Meanwhile, the Africa Rising narrative gained steam. At a summit hosted by the African Union, Traore gave a speech titled Sovereignty with Wings. He didn't just defend the chicken program, he elevated it. The West brings chemicals, China brings machinery, but Africa brings life, he declared. The room erupted. For many African leaders, weary of old paradigms and donor dependence, this wasn't poultry, it was philosophy, it was also politics. Traore used the success to position Burkina Faso as a continental thought leader in agroecological innovation. He proposed the creation of an African poultry corridor, a regional initiative to mobilize chickens, feed, and veterinary services across the Sahel to combat shared pest crises. ECOWAS ministers agreed to explore it. Meanwhile, BRICS nations saw opportunity. China offered to co-finance poultry feed plants. Brazil sent geneticists to develop hybrid breeds suited to the Sahel. India shipped veterinary supplies and vaccines, and all of it, crucially, without structural adjustment strings. The United States? Silent at first, but within policy circles in Washington, there was growing concern. If Burkina Faso's homegrown model caught on across Africa, it could challenge Western aid architecture. One USAID internal memo, later leaked, admitted, there is a risk that localized ecological strategies may reduce demand for conventional intervention packages. Traore, always one step ahead, framed the moment at the United Nations. We did not wait for IMF loans. We did not wait for pesticides from France. We used our own birds. We fed our people. That is what multipolarity looks like. With the world watching and old powers rattled, could Burkina Faso's humble chickens reshape global development itself? The chickens were never meant to stay still, and neither was the movement they sparked. As success stories poured in, from farmers in Kadiogo to poultry markets in Banfora, President Ibrahim Traore began thinking beyond national borders. He saw not just a strategy for Burkina Faso, but a blueprint for the continent. At the next African Union Agriculture Summit, Traore laid it bare. Africa must stop poisoning its soil with chemicals it cannot pronounce, he declared. We must feed our people with our land, our hands, our birds. His words were fiery, but behind them lay hard science and harder politics. The proposal? An integrated Sahelian agroecology network, connecting West African nations in a shared system of biopest control using native poultry, rotational crop cycles, and shared veterinary training. Instead of siloed survival, it was continental solidarity in action. The economic logic was simple. Chickens, once mocked, had become assets. They fertilized fields with manure, fed families with eggs, protected crops from ruin, and reproduced endlessly. Every part of the system worked with nature, not against it. Traore's government branded the concept as the Sahelian farm of the future. In this model, fields were planted not just for harvest, but as feeding zones for chickens. Birds moved in rhythms with crop growth, eating pests at key cycles, leaving behind nutrients. Manure replaced fertilizer, protein replaced hunger, pride replaced pity. This wasn't just agricultural, it was psychological. No longer was Burkina Faso seen as a desperate state on the edge of crisis. It was now referenced in academic journals, trade summits, even classrooms across Africa. Youth movements adopted phrases like Africa feeds Africa and sovereignty with feathers. International media, which had once ridiculed the initiative, now ran features on the program's genius. The Financial Times called it the most cost-effective pest control revolution of the decade. Universities in Kenya and Ethiopia began pilot projects. Nigerian lawmakers debated legislation to trial similar models in the north. But the brilliance of Traore's vision lay in its flexibility. He did not claim chickens were a universal cure. What he claimed, what he proved, was that African problems can be solved with African creativity. The path ahead was not without danger. Disease outbreaks in poultry flocks required constant monitoring. Climate shifts could disrupt breeding patterns, and skeptics still warned of over-reliance on a single species. But Burkina Faso's government, learning as it went, invested heavily in rural veterinary infrastructure, poultry genetics, and training programs. Mistakes were expected, but so was adaptation. And the continent was watching, because beyond the clucks and feathers was a call that Africa Rising would not come from handouts or imported formulas or copied blueprints, but from local ingenuity scaled by courage. Could the continent answer that call, or would Burkina Faso fly alone into the future? Years from now, when scholars revisit the great turning points in African development, they may skip over the numbers and the policy memos. Instead, they will tell a simpler story, that of a president, a plague, and 1 million chickens set loose on the land. Because what Ibrahim Traore achieved was not just pest control, it was perception control. He took a desperate ecological crisis and transformed it into a national myth, a living parable of how sovereignty begins not in boardrooms, but in boldness. In the third year of the program, Burkina Faso had cut its crop losses to insects by more than half. Malnutrition fell, poultry markets flourished, children went to school with eggs in their bellies, and perhaps most importantly, the laughter had stopped. Instead, the world listened. They listened as Traore told the United Nations, "We did not wait. We acted. We did not ask permission. We created." They watched as other African nations began testing the model, not because they were poor, but because they were proud, because they too believed that the era of dependency must end. and that Africa rising means finding value not in mimicry, but in reinvention. The million chickens became more than a solution. They became a symbol of what is possible when leadership meets courage, of what can grow when politics serves the people, of how even the smallest creatures, when trusted, can change the course of history. If this story made you rethink what power looks like, don't scroll away. Like, share, and stand tall. Subscribe now. Africa Rising doesn't begin with speeches. It begins with boldness. So what do you see in this story? A gamble? A gimmick? Or the quiet beginning of a new African century? Tell us in the comments. Say it loud. Africa can do it. Say it louder. Ibrahim Traore showed us how. Because in this age of crisis and uncertainty, one small country dared to lead with wings, and that may be the most powerful message of all.